So here we are, the Food and Faith Ecology webinar. And as this talk is heading into the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll be focusing on grounding and gratitude. This talk is sponsored by the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development and will be led by the organization's founder and executive director, Rabbi Yonatan Neril. He is joined by clergy from 3 different faith traditions, speaking respectively about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The Reverend Dr. Jill Crainshaw, Rabbi Bill Kaplan, and Sheikh Mustafa Umar. We'll first hear an introduction from Rabbi Neril, which will be followed by short talks by each of our panelists, all focusing on the topic of food, faith, and ecology. Then, each of the panelists will engage in a dialogue around a few questions related to this topic. And before we close, we'll open it up to all the participants' questions, so be sure to type those into the chat box. And now, please welcome Rabbi Yonatan Neril. Rabbi? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Kamiko, for the warm introduction, and thank you all for joining this webinar. We're very grateful to have everyone. I'm here in Jerusalem, and we're going to introduce the panelists shortly. This webinar series, this is the first of 2 webinars we're holding at the end of 2020, is in conjunction with the book launch of Ecobible, Volume 1, an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus, which I co-authored together with Rabbi Leo D., who's also here near Jerusalem. We're very grateful that we launched the book a month ago, and last week, praise God, it reached a #1 bestseller on Amazon in several Kindle categories. So it's available on Amazon both as a Kindle and as a paperback, and shortly as a hardcover book as well. I'd like to share with you a short teaching from the book that relates to the topic of this webinar on food and how we relate to food. It's a teaching from the book of Genesis, chapter 25, verse 34. The book of Genesis states, "Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, and he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright." And it's a verse which for Jews relates to the weekly Torah portion that's read on Saturday at synagogues. According to one commentary from about 200 years ago, Rabbi Tzvi Yaakov Mecklenburg, in his book, The Ketava Kabbalah, he contrasts what the Bible says in this verse, that Esau ate and drank and rose, which to how the Torah or the Bible describes Isaac, who it says, when Jacob beckoned him, "Please sit up and eat of my game," that he was sitting down when he was eating. And also the grandfather of Jacob and Esau, Abraham, when he served the angels, he said, quote, "He waited on them and under the tree as they ate." So here, apparently the angels were also sitting and eating under a tree, taking their time. Now, according to this understanding of the Ketava Kabbalah commentary, Esau is uncouth. He eats on the run, which shows his lack of self-control and ultimately his lack of qualification to hold the birthright. Esau, in some ways, represents wasteful consumption, and it's interesting because the next verse in the book of Genesis, verse 35, says there was a famine in the land. And it's, some of the rabbinic commentators relate to this act of hasty eating, and then the Torah immediately says there was famine in the land, as if to hint that when we spurn food and when we don't eat it with the proper intention or in the proper level of holiness, that can have significant physical and spiritual implications. In fact, the first use in the Torah of the word for wasting is in relation to Esau and of his wasting of the birthright. That he's, in some ways, according to Sarah Yehudit Schneider, he's an archetype of thinking only for the present and not for the future. And therefore, that's what causes him to spurn the birthright, Now, I believe the ecological crisis is not a crisis of the bees and the birds or the trees and the toads. It's a crisis of how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. And so I think we can learn from this something for our current times. I want to connect this quick eating of Esau when he was famished and he came from the field and ate quickly and then left, to the slow food movement, which began in 1986 in Italy and has inspired a broader movement called the slow movement. Slow cities, slow tourism, slow money, slow journalism, slow travel, and slow fashion are a few of the examples. It began actually at this movement of the slow food movement began as a protest outside of a McDonald's in Italy, in Rome at the Piazza di Spagna. But now there's over 1,500 local chapters and 100,000 members in 160 countries. So this slow movement has really grown. And they advocate a return to slower living, to more simple food and local leisure, and benefiting communities and reducing one's carbon footprint. So in this time of the pandemic, when many people have not traveled in 9 months or a year, and many people have stayed closer to home, including at home for extended periods for many people, I think that this can take on increasing relevance. What does it mean to slow down? What does it mean to slow down when we eat? To breathe before we eat, to bless before we eat, to bless after we eat. These are questions that we have control over, because one of the main things we have power over in our lives is how we eat, what we eat, how much we eat, with whom we eat, when we eat, how much we chew our food. These are all, you might think of as physical things, but they're also spiritual things. In Hebrew, the word for food, ochel, is an acronym of 3 Hebrew words, ech, kama, velama. How much, why, and how much. Ech, kama, velama. Why am I doing this? How are we approaching our food? Is it binge eating? Or is it holy eating? And so especially now with the run up to Thanksgiving coming soon, it's a good time to revisit this question of eating and how we approach food. So, so with that, I want to continue. And I want to introduce the panelists. Although I see here Kimiko is back, so.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbi, for that framing around this week's Torah portion and what it says about holy eating. So in just a moment, we'll hear from each of our 3 panelists and then be responding to some questions moderated by Rabbi Neril. So if you have any questions that pop up for you, please type them into the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or if you're watching on another one of our streams, say on Facebook or YouTube, you can type them in the comments section. So let's turn to our panelists. First, we have the Reverend Dr. Jill Crainshaw, who is the Blackburn Professor of Worship and Liturgical Theology at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, where she's also Vice Dean for Faculty Development and Academic Initiatives, and teaches in the Food, Health, and Ecological Wellbeing program. Dr. Cranshaw is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church and a well-known author of liturgical theology and a poet. Reverend Crainshaw, welcome.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation today with these colleagues. I want to say a special word of gratitude to Rabbi Neril and Rabbi D for this really powerful, beautiful, wise book that you've provided for us. I'm enjoying reading it. And it has sparked lots of ideas and called me to new challenges for the days ahead. So thank you very much for that. And thank you again for this invitation. I'll offer just a few words from my tradition and from my work on this topic of food, faith, and ecology, grounding and gratitude. I'll begin with a bit of a story. Over the river And through the woods, in a farmhouse in the Virginia mountains, stands Beulah's table, a big friendly table in the center of the kitchen. At that table, Beulah served steaming bowls of just harvested okra and squash to her 7 children. She preserved green beans and memories in wide-mouthed canning jars, lining them up on the table, a nourishing sentry to guard her family through the winter. Beulah rocked little ones to sleep in the chair by the wood-burning stove that was there in the kitchen next to the table. Beulah's table is not fancy. Boxes of cereal, newspapers, mail, photographs, all of that, they camouflage the tabletop. Pound cake too, and the promise of iced tea. And something about all of that makes this table, for me at least, prophetic. Food and fellowship, nourishment and grace are always available. Even when times were hard, friends were welcomed to Beulah's table, strangers too. At that table, bread was broken and stomachs and hearts filled. And in the breaking of the bread, the taste, the sharing, the conversation, God made God's presence known. So how did Beulah's table become a sacred place laden with hospitality and hope? And what does this table have to do with ecological well-being, climate justice, food, faith, ecology? Beulah said it best herself. Nariah Baptist Church saw our family through some hard times. It reminds me, she said, of all the times we had Sunday dinner on the ground. There was always enough and some left over because we all shared. Prayer was the same way too. Our pastor stood behind the communion table. People shared their concerns. The pastor prayed. The church had more than enough love and faith to go around. Beulah's farmhouse kitchen table and Christian worship's communion table share some characteristics: hospitality, nourishment, fellowship, God's presence. From the vantage point of both tables, I think, a redeemed world can be envisioned and maybe even embodied. Beulah taught me the stories, geographies, economies, agricultural bounties of particular places. This is where faith is rooted and from where faith emerges. Ecological well-being and Christian worship practices are connected. To energize this connection, we have to be aware of the links between worship rituals and everyday life, between faith and the places where we live, work, and play. For example, the Lord's Supper is a sacred communal meal of bread and fruit of the earth. Baptism in the Christian tradition is a cleansing and initiation ritual that uses water. These earthy elements and everyday actions connect people in Christian communities to God, Christ, Spirit. What if, I wonder, we also connected these earthy elements and actions, bread and water, eating and washing, to a recognition of how much life's flourishing depends on the health of the earth and our responsible relationships to the earth? In my teaching, I invite my students into these ideas through place-connected worship courses. To learn about baptism, we study the Bible, theology, and we also study place. We visit the local wastewater treatment plant and one of the main creeks that runs through the city to learn more about where our water for baptism comes from, where our drinking water comes from. To learn about communion in the Christian tradition, we explore local sources for bread and bread making. We bake bread together so that we can think about where this bread comes from that we call the bread of life. Jewish and Christian biblical books have bountiful images of God's hope for the healing of creation. Many of these are agricultural and food images. Think about them: an abundant harvest, an overflowing table, a banquet with enough food for all. The teachings of Jesus continue these images of plenty, bread broken and shared on a hillside, provision of food for all. These images are at the heart of Christian scriptural views of who God is and how God intends the world to live. Connected to Beulah's table, I think these texts, these images, these worship practices become powerful and prophetic in a very deep way and connected to the things that we do every single day, washing, eating, sustaining our lives. So I learned at Beulah's table and at Christian communion tables, what we do in worship shapes what we believe and how we act in the world. Worship etiquette shapes public etiquette. We have an amazing opportunity in worship, in our sacred rituals right now, today, to do work that sends people out to change the world. The possibilities await, and I am eager to join with others in communities across faiths and across geographies to embody something that is life-giving and sustaining for this beautiful creation that is God's gift to us all. Thank you again for this invitation and opportunity to be together and to think together about these important questions.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Crainshaw. Thank you so much. Next, we have Rabbi Bill Kaplan, who's the executive director of the Shalom Institute, a year-round experiential Jewish and environmental education center and home of Shemesh Farms. He's an ordained rabbi who uses nature, organic gardens, and biblical gardens to teach about the connections between Judaism and ecology in a model he calls edible Judaism. Rabbi Kaplan, welcome.
Great, thank you, welcome. I'm very honored to be here today and be on this panel. And Rabbi Neril, thank you for inviting me. Also, thank you for the beautiful book. I highly recommend it to everybody. It is now my companion in my weekly Torah study, and it is fantastic. So I want to touch today from the Jewish tradition on what Rabbi Neril started talking about in terms of the slow food movement and about blessings. In Jewish tradition, food, there are blessings over a meal with bread, over a blessing with snacks, over eating fruit, over eating a vegetable. There are many, many blessings before meals, after meals, and really taking time, slowing down, and becoming aware and becoming mindful and becoming conscious of the whole world and the situation and the holiness. In Hebrew, it's kadosh, is holy. And as we eat, we're really taking, by saying these blessings, we're taking a step out of the secular, the profane, and elevating it to a higher level. And one of these prayers that we do, the prayer before the meal, one of the main ones, we call it the Homotzi. Camp, it's the Homotzi. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. We thank God for bringing bread from the earth. And it's very interesting. And I think in terms of what we're talking about, this is a very unique prayer because it says to take bread from the earth, but bread doesn't automatically come from the earth. First of all, it tells us that we are a partner with the divine, that we have to take wheat. If we're making bread, chita in Hebrew, we have to take that wheat, that grain, and do something with it. We have to make that bread. It also reminds us that bread just doesn't automatically appear. Doesn't automatically appear on our table, doesn't automatically appear in our supermarkets. And often that's what we see. That's what the world sees. We don't necessarily see how it comes to us, but it reminds us, that blessing reminds us that the grain has to be grown, it has to be harvested. Our food has to be raised. It has to then be harvested and then transported somewhere to us. There's a whole process. It just doesn't magically appear. And we have to be mindful. It reminds us to be aware of that. At Shalom Institute, at our overnight camp, when we begin every session of kids coming to camp and we teach them about the blessings, we talk about the Hamotzi, about where the whole process of how and where our food comes from, all the different systems. And if you peel those systems back, if you look behind the supermarket and see see where these things come from and how the food is being raised and harvested, it really as we learn more and we educate more people about these different processes, we can really see some of the roots, the systems that are roots to our ecological crises, how things are raised, how things are grown, how things are transported, what some of the ecological challenges that we're facing are all connected, really. I mean, in many ways, a lot of them are connected to the food and how it's being prepared and how it's being raised. And this, for me, and I think in our Jewish tradition, really understanding that, it really, and the mindfulness and the holiness, it really connects to all the different Jewish ecological values that are key. Being good stewards, shomrei adamah, keepers of the earth, for not wasting, to taking care, ethical treatment of animals, tzarei balei chayim. These are all part of that, but it only comes from this consciousness. And I think the blessings provide that individual consciousness. In our camp and in our faith communities, we do it as a community. But I really think that as we do this, we need to have a collective consciousness. And I think those blessings begin that, because that's the only way that I believe that we are going to make significant change, to have a tipping point. I think the good news is that I think there is a collective consciousness happening. And hopefully by being mindful, slowing down, seeing eating as a holy, as a spiritual experience, we're able to understand all these systems, educate ourselves about these systems, how the food comes to us, how it's being sourced, processed, raised in an ethical and spiritual manner. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaplan. All right, and up next we have Sheikh Mustafa Umar, who's the Director of Education and Outreach at the Islamic Institute of Orange County and the President of California Islamic University, a school he founded to offer a bachelor's in Islamic education. He's earned multiple degrees in Islamic science and Islamic law from across the world and has published a variety of books on Islam. Sheikh Umar, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. First of all, I'm really honored to be invited here. I know the book was primarily on Genesis and Exodus, and I'm glad that I was able to get an opportunity to address what the Quran says about this, because there are 2 billion Muslims in the world, and they're as concerned as our brothers, the Jewish and Christian brothers, or anyone else for that matter, brothers in humanity and sisters in humanity, about any of these things. So when it comes to Islam's stance on ecology, what is the relationship between different organisms to one another and the relationship between organisms to their surroundings? I just want to set a framework of how Muslims look at this from a Quranic worldview. So in the beginning of the Quran, in the 2nd chapter, in verse 30, one of the verses says, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. That's Arabic, so I'll translate it for you right now. It says that, remember when your Lord said to the angels that I'm going to create a deputy in the earth, or a vicegerent in the earth. So basically what happens is this story is talking about the beginning of creation, very similar to Genesis. It's talking about the beginning of the creation of the first human being, and that's Adam. And it says that God told the angels that were there, he said, I'm going to create this new human being, this new creation, this new thing, and it's going to be a human. And his job is going to be that he's going to be a deputy or a khalifa in the earth. So what that means is really important to focus on, to understand the Islamic worldview, is that the position of human beings on earth is that as a deputy on behalf of God. What that means is that God is saying that, yes, I've created this world, and yes, I've created it to test you, but I'm not going to intervene in every single conflict to stop every single vice from happening. That's your job. That's your responsibility as humans. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And then the next verse, or the same verse, it says, قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَن يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا. So the angels start questioning, and they're like, well, why are you going to create this new thing that has free will? It has the ability to do so many bad things. So they're saying, why would you create someone that can cause destruction and havoc and just like do so many bad things? Why would you put that thing on the earth when you could create us? Like the angels are like, you know, we don't do anything bad. We can't really, we just do whatever you say, God. Why would you make this thing instead of making someone like us? And the angels figured out, you know, if you have free will, if these human beings have free will, they're going to potentially do some really bad things. And the response from God was, قَالَ إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. He said, I know exactly what I'm doing. Basically means that he's trying to explain that human beings, because of their free will, are capable of greatness. And a free will, the virtue of free will, when someone does something good, is superior to like this robotic pre-programmed virtue that like some kind of, you know, if we were robots or, you know, we were like a robot animal or something, that virtue is not the same as like, you know, the artificial intelligence virtue compared to a free will virtue. They're not the same. So human beings are capable of doing great things, and they have been put in a status of deputy over the earth, over the world, over all animals, over all plants, over all things. So because of that, that's a blessing. Human beings are viewed in Islam as having a superior status to all other living things and having a superior status to all inanimate objects. But with every blessing comes a responsibility. And the responsibility is, yes, we can use some of these things. We can use the environment. We can cut down trees. We can use them for our benefit. You know, we can make, you know, a tissue paper from it. We can make chopsticks to, you know, to eat our noodles or something, but we're not supposed to be abusing it. So if our responsibility is there, we can use things, but we're not supposed to abuse them. I can speak for hours about this. Islam says a lot about it. The Prophet Muhammad, he spoke about so many things when it comes to not overloading animals. When it comes to when we wash ourselves for prayer, he says, do not waste even a little amount of water, even when you're washing yourself for prayer. Even if you're at the stream of a river, do not end up wasting the water that's there. And another verse that comes to mind is that it says in chapter 30, verse 41, it says, ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. It says that corruption has spread on the land and in the sea because of what people's hands have sent forth. Meaning things have gone really bad in the land and in the seas because of what people are doing, because of the bad things that they're doing. And then the rest of the verse, it says, لِيُذِيقَهُمْ بَعْدَ الَّذِي عَمِلُوا لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. Why did these bad things happen? It says, so that they may taste some of the fruits of what they're doing, so that they might return back to the right way. Meaning that all of this, what people have been doing, they're doing these bad things. And you see the fruits of that in the world around us. And the world has been created in a balance. And God is saying in the Quran is saying here that you're seeing the fruits so that you might start thinking, realizing, hey, this is really causing a lot of problems. If we look at the world today, this is what's happening in our world today, so that we might turn back and say, hey, we need to change our way of life. We need to change things, right? So this is kind of the perspective or the framework of what Islam is teaching. And the Prophet Muhammad, he's also said, and I'll conclude with this, he said that every single person has to perform acts of charity every single day. And then he said, وَإِمَاتَتُكَ الْحَجَرَ وَالشَّوْكَةَ وَالْعَظْمَ عَنِ الطَّرِيقِ لَكَ صَدَقَةً. He said that when you remove like a rock or a thorn or a bone or something from the pathway where people are going to be walking, that's considered to be an act of charity. If we look at that from the perspective of ecology, the amount of things that we need to be doing that are potentially going to be harming people or that are clearly harming people today, we need to make sure that we are removing some of those harms for ourselves, for our children, for the people around us. And that is a responsibility, and it counts as an act of charity for us. So again, thank you very much for this invitation, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sheikh Umar. So now we're going to move to the question and answer portion of today's talk. And if I can have all of our panelists come back on screen so we can delight in the wealth of all of this wisdom that's available to us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Rabbi Neril. Rabbi Neril?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sheikh Mustafa Umar. Thank you, Reverend Cranshaw. Thank you, Rabbi Kaplan, for your sharing. So I want to now open this to a few. I want to ask a question to sort of start us off in conversation, and the question relates to food waste. As you're aware, about 1/3 of food that's produced in the world is wasted, according to United Nations statistics. And since 85% of people in the world identify with a religion, religions and religious institutions could do a lot in regards to food waste. And so I'd like to ask, and the three of you are involved with significant theological and spiritual institutions. In what ways in the work that you do and of your institution, do you try to reduce food waste? Feel free to unmute yourself and respond.
Yeah, I'll be glad to share. I teach at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I teach at the Divinity School there, but we are connected to the larger university in some pretty significant ways. And the university has a very robust sustainability program that functions for the entire university. And one of the ways we have tried to respond to issues of food waste is through a program that we call Campus Kitchen. Campus Kitchen repurposes food that is not consumed in our various eating places on campus, repurposes it in the Winston-Salem community. It's an asset-based approach to partnering with a network of civic and other nonprofit and private organizations to try to share this food with people in our community who need it. And it has created partnerships between our food supplier on campus, Aramark, Fresh Market, a local regional food grocery store, Lowe's Foods, and local farmers. And in 2018, I don't have the statistics for more recently than that, but Deacon Dining, which is our on-campus food supplier, donated over 8,500 pounds to Campus Kitchen, which was then distributed more widely in our community to people who have need. So that's one of our most significant programs on campus. And I think it teaches students something about their own eating habits and how much waste is produced and how that can be shared with others if we decide to be more generous in the ways that we share.
I'll jump in. So Shalom Institute is located in Malibu, California, and on a totally different ecological issue. 2 years in terms of climate change, Shalom Institute was our campus was destroyed by the Woolsey fire. 95% of our buildings gone, the whole place just devastated. So as we're building back and rebuilding and thinking about our farm, garden, and our whole operation, we are continuing the work that we were doing prior and we're doing in other locations all over Southern California, is really thinking about our food policies and what we were doing prior to the fire. I mean, when we're operating, is really looking holistically at the systems where, you know, we're serving 1,500 meals during the summer. We serve about 25,000 people through our doors. We're year round. And in our dining hall, we're educating people about food waste. Number one, at the kids, we are often doing weighing food, Solit. It's called Solit, where you're looking at, you know, how much food the kids really understand, how in terms of weighing what's left over. They're really understanding the impact of how they are eating. We also have compost, and we are making sure we're reusing the food. We also have animals who love to have, whether they're tortoises from the leftover salad, salad bar, to other items that our animals can eat that actually then turn into other compost. We're just looking at how do we keep the food waste down. And just from the beginning, in terms of putting out food, eating, food served family style, we're not on purpose, we're not putting over portions out. People have to come back up to the dining hall window to get more food, and really just looking at holistically at the system. As I was saying, as we're building back, and I see some people who are on this webinar too are helping us, we are really looking to take that to a whole other level in terms of all of our operations and just continuing the work that we've been doing before. But I think education is so important with the people that we have that are coming through our doors. That's like the number one, to be able to share and actually do it in action. It's really modeling it there, so they can take it back with them to, what we say, tikkun olam, to make the world a better place.
Yeah, for us, very similar. So in our Islamic Institute in the mosque, which you can see in the background over here, it's in Anaheim, there's a very important messaging about not wasting food. And that's something that we constantly remind people about. And then when we do meals, we have community programs, especially in the month of Ramadan. There's lots of community dinners taking place. One of the things we try to make sure we do is we have buffets rather than just giving out boxes, because what ends up happening is, if you don't like, a certain type of rice, or you don't like the tomatoes, you don't like the onions, it goes in your box, it's going to end up in the trash can. So we try to always insist on making sure buffets over just the boxes, even though it takes more time. It results in people having to stand in line, unfortunately, for a while, but we clarify to our congregants why we're doing that. We're doing that because we have measured and we have checked how much food gets wasted when we do this versus when we do this. So that's just one of the things. The second thing we do is, at every event that we have, we always have boxes to go ready. So if someone cannot finish their food, we hand out those boxes and we make an announcement and say, look, we have the boxes ready for you. Please take a box, put your food in there and take it home, and you can eat it for dinner, and you can eat it, later on, so that there's no food going to be wasted at all. So this is a constant reminders are being done. That's being done as well. And then another thing we do, we actually do the box idea at weddings. So one of the things I do in my sermons is I tell people, Muslims have really large weddings. They're really into the renting out the hotel and doing the whole buffet and, good food and all that. So we've encouraged, and it's become almost a standard practice in our community now, that whenever there's going to be a wedding, there's going to be that buffet. We put a stack of boxes at every single buffet line, and whatever you can't eat, you take it home with you. And whatever food is left over, usually when there's a wedding, people will over order, because you never know how many people are going to show up for a wedding or a program. So they usually over order by 20 or 50 because they don't want to look bad. So we say always put those boxes. So even when the leftover food is there, the MC makes an announcement at the end of the program and say, everyone fill up, take all of this food home. It's good quality food. You could eat it tomorrow, or you could drop it off to someone who is in need. And that's really significantly decreased the food waste that's going on in our community. And that's our responsibility as Muslims. So these are some of the things that we do.
Thank you, Sheikh Umar, for sharing that. That's really encouraging to hear that your community is so proactive in addressing food waste, especially at large gatherings when there can be large amounts of food waste, especially as you mentioned, with people over ordering in order to show that there's an abundance of food even after 500 people take multiple portions of it. Yeah. I want to follow up with a second question that to me sort of cuts at another important issue on the intersection between ecology and religion, which relates to the consumption of animal products, of meat and dairy and eggs, which in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim rituals, there traditionally has been a consumption of such products. And at the same time, as we're all aware, the consumption of such products has a significant ecological impact in various ways. And so I want to ask, how do you relate to a vegetarian or a vegan diet in terms of the work that you do and the institutions that you're a part of?
I'll go ahead and start on this one. So one of the things that we do, we try to give messaging. So there's 2 billion Muslims in the world, coming from very different cultures and different communities. And in America, you find that diversity. And so like in our mosque that you can see in the background here, we have like 50 to 60 different countries represented. And each one of them come with different cultures. So some of those cultures, they already have a lot of vegetables in their diet. A lot of vegetarian dishes are naturally part of their culture. So messaging to them is going to be very different than messaging to people who need kebabs, like, for every single meal, or they have to have like chicken tikka masala or something like that, at everything. So I try to focus specifically on those communities that tend to eat a lot of meat, and make them understand, number one, what are the health implications of it? And number two, what are the ecological implications of it in terms of the sustainability, in terms of how animals are being treated in factory farms, and also pushing for, when you push for the idea that, we were taught in Islam that we have to take care of animals in a certain way. We have to slaughter them in a certain way. We have to raise them in a certain way. We have to make sure that one animal is not seeing the other animal, being slaughtered. Otherwise, it's gonna die before its death. That's a principle that the Prophet, Muhammad taught. So when they get that part right, they understand that, hey, a source of our animals is becoming a problem. They start to cut down because they know the majority of the meat is coming from factory farming. So when they cut down from there, then they understand the ecological implications that, hey, this is how much water, this is how much grain, this is how much food is being used to feed these animals in order to get the meat on your plate. So even though meat is viewed as like a luxury item, it should remain a luxury item. It shouldn't become the absolute gold standard of what you eat all the time throughout everything. So that's kind of the messaging we're getting across, for people to look and substitute other dishes along with their meat diet. And I think that gradualism is something that works best in our community, given the amount of meat consumption that's generally there. And I think the awareness among the younger generation in particular, they seem to be more open to change. Younger people seem to be always more open to change and more open to listening to this messaging. So the focus is to try to explain in general to maybe the parents and the grandparents, and kind of really put it a little bit more on the children to start asking for these alternative dishes in their home. And they're doing that, and we've seen positive results with that.
These are such great insights and ideas, so I want to think more about all of them. At Wake Forest, our dining services emphasize what we call plant-forward dining. So we've not eliminated meat from dining options for students at Wake Forest University, but we have de-emphasized meats. And when we do have meat on the menus and available in the dining halls, we are trying to utilize responsible sourcing and local sourcing when possible. But the plant-forward dining really tries to hold up vegetables, plant-based eating as primary and important, not only for physical health, but also ecological well-being. So overall, I think the goal is to minimize our footprint through waste reduction, planning how much food to prepare and how much to order, tracking food production and food consumption on campus, and then having this plant-forward push to encourage students to consider everybody, employees that eat on campus as well, to think more about the kinds of food we're eating, where it comes from, how we're eating it. So I think the educational component goes along with the practical component, and both are quite important. We also, in our program, have this food, faith, and health concentration for Divinity students, and we're really wanting students to have an opportunity, if they want to be trained in ways that they can help their congregations or not-for-profits or other places where they're doing ministry to be more aware of how food production and agriculture works in our communities and places, and to do work toward climate justice, sustainability, food accessibility for people in communities that don't have access to healthy foods, that sort of thing. So it is, I think, important that that our institutions have a kind of broad approach, in that we provide the kinds of foods that we believe are healthy and ecologically sustainable to the people, and we're educating people about why that's important, inviting them to change their habits and their practices outside of their relationship to the school.
So very similar, actually. I love what they both said, because it's very similar to what we do in practice, and what we're hoping as we, move forward to integrate more of everything into what we're doing. And again, it's just mindfulness and being aware. Groups or different organizations that are renting our facility, but we've begun to integrate into those meat meals to replace with actually plant-based, like whether it's a barbecue with a Impossible Burger or a Beyond Burger or other types of plant-based meals, and again educating our population. What I'm seeing, I think the good news is I think over the next few years with all this education, and we're seeing it more and more. I've been at the Shalom Institute for 30 years, where I see there is a demand for more plant-based diets and more consciousness around this issue. So I think there's something positive as we move forward.
Great, thank you, each of you, for sharing very important insights. I really consider the three of you to be, ahead of the curve in terms of the, our fellow faith adherents in terms of the work you're doing in each of your institutions. I'd like to now encourage the people who are viewing this either on Zoom or on Facebook Live to type in any questions that you have for our last 10 minutes together. In the meantime, I'd also just like to open it up to the three panelists. If any of you want to respond to anything that the others said, or if you have any questions for the others, so now feel free to ask or comment. Okay, so I'd now like to ask if you could share any advice you have for staying mindful and grateful this holiday season, especially for those who are going to be going into Thanksgiving, but also for other holidays coming up. What can you share with us about how can we stay mindful and grateful in regards to food in particular?
Well, I'll say in Hebrew, hakarat tov means it's the word for gratitude. We're talking about gratitude and grounding, and I would say that it actually translates to recognizing the good. So I just love what the other panelists are saying. I love what's in your in the book and all the materials that are connected to that. And I think we have to remember there are issues out there. We have to continue to be diligent in moving forward with intention, but also recognizing the good that's coming out of all this and the things that are happening, that there is change happening in the world if we continue to be diligent in moving forward and be thankful that we see the good as we move forward.
The earlier comments about the slow food movement strike me as being really important. Slow eating, slow food, mindful eating. It's an important part of our upcoming feasting celebrations, because I think it's an opportunity to slow down, cook together with family members or friends, share conversation at the table, so that we're not only eating food, but we're actually enjoying a meal. And I think meals suggest relationships and connections and that sort of thing, where food is celebrated as part of our connection to the earth, rather than just elements of food that we do have to have for sustenance, but that also are a part of our humanity. So I think tending to that and attending to that is really a powerful thing. I also think about when I teach students about celebrating Christian communion and breaking bread at the table, I always ask them to consider where that bread actually came from, because often pastors will go down the street and buy it at the grocery store. Not always, but often. And I want them to think about, so what farmer produced that, and the worker that you just purchased that from in the line at the grocery store, what hourly wage do they make to supply you with this bread of life that's so central to our faith commitment? So I think we can also do some thinking about people who are working hard and often for very small wages to make these feasts of abundance available to us during these holiday times.
The Reverend just gave me an idea as well. You know, there's a saying that some people, they live to eat and others eat to live. And I think that's really representative of many of our communities here in America. A lot of people, they really live to eat, and they become like foodies, and they travel around, and food becomes like something really important in their life, you know, let alone ways to deal with stress and all of that. And I think when we're going through these celebrations and we're enjoying the good food, not only are we thanking God for the food that we have and understanding where it came from, but also we think about all those people who don't even have anything close to what we're eating right now. And sometimes we sit there and we look at one dish and we're like, oh, you know, I don't like that, I like this one. But there are people out there, millions and millions of people out there who don't have any food at all, and they don't even have a choice in what they're going to eat. So when I think about that, and it just reminds me how blessed I am and how privileged I am, I think it's very important that we keep all of our privileges there in mind. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, "Unzur ila man asfala minkum wa la tanzuru ila man huwa fawqakum." He said, always look at people who have less than you, and don't look at people who are better off than you. And he said, why? Because that is more conducive to you being grateful to God, and to being more conducive to not belittling the blessings that you've been given. So I think that's something we should always keep in mind.
Thank you, Sheikh Umar, for reminding me of the power of an interfaith webinar. For me, it's that you reminded me of some teachings in my own tradition, and one of the powers of interfaith cooperation is that it helps to strengthen each of us in our own spiritual practices. One thing that you said reminds me how this year the United Nations World Food Program received the Nobel Peace Prize. And they did that partly because this year, the number of people who are on the verge of starvation or actually starving is doubling because of the coronavirus pandemic. And with the closure that many countries are instituting and the restrictions on movement, there are now hundreds of millions of people that are essentially chronically malnourished and that don't have access to food. Mostly in the global south. While in the global north, there's a different issue with food, which is an obesity epidemic in many countries. So one thing that I'm reminded of is the challenge of holy eating, of approaching food with the right mentality, and eating, as Reverend Crainshaw mentioned, eating with people, enjoying the company of others, using food as a means of engaging in and inviting in the divine presence. And with Rabbi Kaplan, whose institution tragically burned down 2 years ago in the Wolseley fire, as you're rebuilding and with the amazing sustainability efforts that you're doing. So I just want to conclude our hour together by mentioning that this is the first in a series of interfaith ecology webinars that we're hosting. The next one is going to take place on December 10th and will be on the topic of climate realities, climate change, with 3 other eminent panelists from different institutions, including Pepperdine University and the former president of the Academy of American Religion. And they focus on the topics of climate denial, climate migration, and climate war. In addition, You can find more about that on the interfaithsustain.com/webinars. And you can also learn more about Ecobible on interfaithsustain.com/Ecobible, which is also available on Amazon. So I want to thank the panelists for joining us, and I want to thank everyone who participated, and just give us a blessing that we should be able to find in the depth and wisdom of our faith traditions the way forward in regards to holy eating, and in so doing, invite the divine into our lives. Thank you very much.